Okay, why don't we start, I mean, a bit maybe unconventional, but since we're together, if I can start asking you questions just for 5 minutes about perceptions about Saudi Arabia, about religion in Saudi Arabia, that would help me actually maybe guide some of the details I would speak up here. And so, I mean, just a sentence, yeah, I mean, so start.
I guess I should disclose myself as a geographer who teaches geography of languages, religions in the Middle East. So,
oh, okay.
Maybe you should talk to some other people. I have a fairly good understanding, but I haven't actually been to Saudi Arabia, so I'm here to learn more.
Okay. And yourself?
As a student and as someone who rarely looks at things in that part of the region, part of the world, I really think Saudi Arabia is portrayed as isolated from the rest of the world, even the rest of the Middle East.
Yeah, that's
what I get is CNN and Fox.
okay. And
I'm a little bit biased. I'm Muslim, so, but culturally, I don't know as much about Saudi Arabia as I could other than games, but I know it is generally the same where we go.
okay. Okay, so that, if anyone wants to add anything at any time, I mean, we can make it a bit informal in how we go about it. Now, the theme is a bit, it's a mix, it's a bit theoretical. It has some, maybe some practical side to it, but it's more about how people analyze or behavior in Saudi Arabia. Now, you know, Saudi Arabia is reduced through the media to oil and religion, and also maybe with the latest, the last few years, women not being able to drive, restrictions on their freedom and rights. Lately, even people being lashed for not, you know, for driving. If you're following, especially Fox, they would definitely highlight that. But Saudi Arabia is a very complicated country, like any other country. Part of the complexity in understanding Saudi Arabia is maybe because it's a bit isolated, insulated in a way. Not too many people have the right access to it. There is too much news on the two main issues that go on in Saudi Arabia, security, terrorism, and then on the other side, some issues about religion. So that in a way obscures or complicates people, you know, the understanding for those who actually want to have a more realistic perception about it. But what I want to focus on here is one of the aspects about Saudi Arabia, which is religion, and how it's portrayed, or how it, in my belief, it should be portrayed. The title "Decentralizing Religion," I don't mean decentralizing religion as a way of life in Saudi Arabia. It's more about decentralizing it as a framework of analyzing Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabian social behavior. Saudi Arabia is a religious country, but being religious does not mean that you can actually analyze politics or even social dynamics through religion. People talk about religion, but they're not really always motivated by religion. So the main objective here, or the main takeaway value, is to free us, or let's say at least loosen the deep association between religion and social behavior, also political behavior, in the analysis of Saudi Arabia. I'm going to mention an example. This is a fairly old one. It's almost about a year ago, but it's a recurring theme in Saudi Arabia. So whatever I say here can apply this year, next year, maybe even 5, 6, almost every year you have the same kinds of stories. There was someone, he's called Yusuf Al-Ahmad, and he's given this sort of dignitary title, Lion of Al-Hisba. Al-Hisba is an Arabic word for how would one translate it accurately? It's like, you know, sometimes when you hear the statement, if you see something, say something, and well, Hisba is about that. So if you see something, you have to say something. You have to also do something. And but Hisba is usually or has been usually restricted in Saudi Arabia to doing or saying against society. So people see wrong things or see mistakes or deviances in social behavior, and then they sort of act against them. Hisba against the state hasn't been very prominent except for the last 2 years, but even that was quite narrow and limited to speaking against the state, but not actually acting against it, except when the cases which were called terrorist activities against the state. So there was this a person called Yusuf Al-Ahmad. He's a prominent scholar, and he became more prominent when he started acting against many of what he saw as social deviances going on in Saudi Arabia. And so some of the religious some of the religious scholars and also some of his followers gave him that title. Now, these are 4 cases where this person, Yusuf Al-Ahmad, became a major protagonist or a sort of a hero in them. And I'm going to take this as a case to analyze his behavior from a religious perspective or from a socio-political perspective, and then see how those two are different. So some of the issues which were going on around the last few years until now is the female employment in the country. There's a lot of many women are entering the workforce in an exponential rate, and many of those women are working in mixed environments. And in Saudi Arabia, the preferred situation for the let's say the conservative social segment is segregation between men and women. So female employment was causing a challenge. It was also causing a challenge because the way it was happening was leading to more independence in the decision making of many women, and that also created some anxiety among some of the conservatives. And then the other element was, one of the consequences of that, or one of the sectors where employment was happening was cashiers in supermarkets. So the government allowed for the first time for women to work as cashiers in supermarkets, which is, I mean, not significant in a Western context, even in an Arab context. But in Saudi Arabia, it was extremely challenging because then you were actually interfacing with women on a day-to-day basis in a context where this wasn't happening. You would barely. The only place where you actually interact with female employment in Saudi Arabia was almost restricted to hospitals, nurses or clerks working in hospitals. That would happen. Beyond hospitals, it was almost quite rare. I mean, banks are segregated, so you have women-only banks, and then you have the men-only banks. So having women working in cashiers where everybody would actually interact with them was considered a challenge, and it was like a front, like an opening, a window which people wanted to shut before it actually brought in too much wind. And then you had another issue also related to women, which was the opening of the of KAUST, King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. About 2 years ago, when it was inaugurated, it was known that it will have mixed classes. You don't have mixed classes in Saudi Arabia, so men and women study separately. And KAUST is the only university now in Saudi Arabia that has actually a mixed class. So that also created a lot of uproar among a certain segment of the population. And then you also had the issue of allowing female teachers to teach boys up to the 3rd grade. And that was introduced about a couple of years ago as well, and it caused also some uproar with some of those conservative elements. And when I say conservative segments, the word conservative is a very elastic word. It can mean so many things. So I don't want to, I wouldn't want us to take too much into the term. I'm just, using it because there is no other word now to use to describe that kind of, that specific segment. But in general, it's not a majority. They're a minority in a certain way. They might represent sentiments of the majority in certain issues, but not in all. So, for example, in the issue of women working as cashiers, their uproar wasn't representative of a majority. But in the issue of, let's say, gender mixing, it might in a certain way. and the issue of women driving, you would have a mixed opinion between Saudis. When I say Saudis, I mean Saudi males, but also females, because many of these issues are supported by women as well as by men. I mean, some women don't want a mixed environment. Some women don't want to promote driving. Some women, it's not just the men who are restricting it on the women. So there was this decision to actually have female teachers become a teacher until 3rd grade. And they actually gave it a word. They called it feminization of boys. Is that, you know, by teaching boys until the 3rd grade, you're making them sissies in a certain way. And there was an uproar against it from this, you know, line of al-Hitba. So these 4, and maybe others, I mean, if you have incidents you've heard on the news, they can also be included in this. Any situation that is associated with a religion can apply as examples to what I'm going to be talking about. Now, the usual framework of analyzing all of this, because the protagonist is a religious scholar, and because the language he uses is religious, all the terminology he uses against mixing, against women interacting with boys, against women becoming too independent, all the, you know, the language is religious. He uses scripture from the Quran or from the Prophet's saying. So usually the reaction from the media locally in Saudi Arabia and also internationally is to analyze it religiously. And the logic would go in this form. It's, you know, somebody has a religious impulse, and that impulse prompts piety in some protagonist to take action against a perceived sin or deviation to support the cause of God against the infidel aggressor or the Muslim apostate. Now, this line of thinking, I broke it down into different sectors, just to sort of see, you know, because there are different things being said here. So it's important, if one wants to analyze it, to actually break it down into these 7 elements or 6 elements. And but the main logic here is that religion is the motivator behind such actions, be it those simple social incidents, or even it can apply to violence. So let's say someone blowing himself up in Saudi Arabia, or even outside Saudi Arabia, in Palestine, in Israel, in India, Pakistan. In the end, a religious framework would basically relate religious impulse to action. And this is the case which was going on, or this is the kind of understanding that was being applied on the behavior of Yusuf al-Ahmad, or, you know, line of al-Hitba. And once you frame the analysis in this way, the course of action would be constrained by this kind of framework. So you analyze it in a certain way, and then when people want to intervene in policy or as a reaction or to make change, this would be this would be their guiding, let's say, thoughts towards that. And I'll mention that in a minute. So let's say, and when you have a religious framework, you can always come out with, you know, 2 different consequences. So a religious framework, such as the one I mentioned before, or any other framework which, you know, relates piety or religion to action, would either, you know, would use a set of data 1, let's say, so I would go to the Quran and find a scripture which condones or which supports some kind of violence, you know, like some of the verses on jihad, for example. Or I would go and find the statements from various scholars across the Islamic world, or let's say, since we're talking about Saudi Arabia, in Saudi Arabia, about people whose language is extremely radical, extremely rejecting the other, promoting exclusion of non-Muslims, for example. And then you would come out that Islam is an incubator for radicalism, because that set of data basically brought out that kind of conclusion. But then you can also use other sets of data where you can get verses where Islam promotes peace from the Quran, scriptures which promote that, or you can go and take statements from scholars that promote peace and promote inclusionary way of life, and then you would say that Islam promotes peace. And what I want to say here is that in both cases, when we read those kinds of analysis, they all go back from, they all depend on one basic framework, which is that religion drives social behavior and drives political behavior. So they might come out with different consequences or different outcomes, but in the end, they all depend on the same kind of framework. And what I'm proposing here, or what I'm suggesting, is that we need to not only change the data we're depending on, because usually most of the debate and these kinds of outcomes, the debate usually comes back to the data. So I would argue with somebody saying that Islam promotes radicalism by giving him another set of data, so that he would include it in his argument, or he would do the same with me. So, and we start entering a debate about what data he has and what data I have, and we just keep, incidents and small details here and there become the focus of the whole debate and the whole argument. But what really should happen is that we should go back a step further and say, well, maybe the whole framework we're using to analyze the whole situation needs to be reviewed. It's not only the information that we're having. Now, a consequence of, practical outcomes of such a framework would be courses of actions would be influenced by that framework, and it obscures alternatives and also defines the protagonist. So the courses of action which one sees in Saudi Arabia, for example, when I follow the media or have discussions with various people about this issue, because religion is seen as the driver, so the course of action would be is to wrestle against religion. That's one of the actions, and some of the liberal or maybe ultra-liberal segments of the society have that as their agenda. So for them, religion is the cause of all that behavior. So then we have to wrestle with that religion. Another course of action, which hasn't happened a lot in Saudi Arabia, but it has happened in other Muslim countries, is to constrain piety. So you had in Syria and Tunisia in the past where people would actually be constrained. People who go to mosques would have, would be questioned. In Saudi Arabia, you'll have it, but in a very, very subtle way, because piety is a primary value there. So that didn't happen in Saudi Arabia, but that's the course of action which people would think about when they believe that religion drives social and political behavior. But what really is going on in Saudi Arabia, and this is the most, this is where most of the debate happens, is people start offering alternative religious impulses, so to say. So when they speak about moderation, what they're really talking about is how do we create a new impulse? So this impulse created radicalism, so we have to create another impulse to create moderation. And then the debate goes about the curricula, goes about interpreting the scripture, goes about understanding what sayings of the Prophet are authentic and not authentic, and it goes on and on in that direction. And another alternative, which is, I hyphenated it because it's part of the conspiracy theory which some people keep promoting, is that we have to corrupt the society. So some people consider that a lot of the media that the Saudi youth are being exposed to is a course of action against religion. But that's not a serious one. But the main point I want to say is there's a course of action that is dictated, so to say, by believing that religion promotes social behavior. But another consequence is that it obscures alternative ways of analyzing behavior, because even the Saudi terrorists, whether they acted in America, in Iraq, or in Saudi Arabia, many of them belong to a certain social structure which would promote a certain kind of radicalism. And being Muslims, they express their radicalism in the language they belong to. So, if they were living 40 years ago, they would have expressed it in some sort of pan-Arab or socialist language, because that was the language which was available for radicalists. If they lived in maybe 100 years ago, they might have had another language. But in the end, what happens is that some alternative analysis or understanding is obscured, and primarily the ones I mentioned here, marginalization. There's a lot of marginalization in Saudi Arabia for many of the social classes there. You have people from the south, from the center, from the east and the west. It's a big country, and a lot of segments feel that they're not given enough access to the opportunities that the country can offer them. Many of them feel that they're considered second-class citizens in a certain way. A prime example would be Shiites, but they feel that they're not incorporated into the state as full citizens. But you also have marginalization with other segments in the country. So that's another way of understanding why people react violently or become radical which isn't mentioned a lot in the news in Saudi Arabia because for reasons I'll mention now. But I mean, that's one. Another one is political freedoms. When you're constrained in your political freedom, you usually resort to radicalism, and it's really there isn't a one-to-one relationship between that, but it's one of the elements which can actually promote radical expressions or radical behavior. And then you have a more subtle element, which is anxieties of modernity. Saudi Arabia is in modernity, even if they're fighting it in a way. I mean, they live it, they breathe it, they eat it, they drink it. So, and a lot of the social structures which people were very familiar with are eroding as a consequence, and that causes a lot of tension. And when you accumulate that tension across the whole nation, 27 million or 22 million, you would find a few who would actually become radical as a consequence. So a statistical consequence of a high level of anxiety would be that some would become criminals, and some would become radical, and some would become, it's just basically statistics. And then you have the economic policies, which are creating a lot of unemployment. You have now in Saudi Arabia, I think the last official figure was about 11%, but the unofficial ones go up to 20% and higher. And in a country where 50% of the population is under 15 years old, 20% or even 11% unemployment means that you have effectively maybe 30 or 40 breadwinners that don't have a job because the other 50% are unemployable. They can't work in any way. And then you have the pressures of demographic changes, in particular the growing number of youth. Now, these alternative ways of analyzing why people become radical, religiously or not, are obscured, aren't talked about enough, and for a very important reason. When it comes to the government, it prefers not to talk about these elements because then it becomes the main cause of it, or it becomes the main source of solution. And if they fail, it's a failure in their part. But then you also have the religious establishment doesn't want to minimize the role of religion in creating radicalism, because if religion creates the problem, then religion is also the solution. So they become a source of the solution, and being part of the solution means access to resources, means access to budgets, means access to decision makers. So they're very keen to establish this one-to-one relationship between radicalism and religion because it gives them an edge. And then you have the liberal elements in the country that also want to keep that relationship because it also serves their agenda. They want to sort of minimize the role of religion, and they believe that by associating it with violence, that objective will happen. Now, the other consequence is the main protagonist becomes the religious person. So a religious framework would have many consequences, but three of those consequences are what course of action we take, what alternatives are obscured, and what protagonists we have to deal with. And they become the heroes, the religious elements. Now, a non-religious framework would go about in this way, and it would basically say that, we have to first of all create a trichotomy between motivation, justification, and language. So people are motivated by a certain basic needs and aspirations and ambitions, but then as human beings, we need to justify our behavior in a moral language. And when we need some kind of moral sense. We have to give it some kind of value. Even when someone kills someone, unless he or she are a psychopath, they need to say that we're doing it for a good reason. And it's basically part of who we are. And then you have the language that people express that kind of motivation. So let's say Yusuf Al-Ahmad is motivated by whatever. He has to justify his motivations in a moral language, and he'd use the language that is available to him, which is basically Islam. So his radicalism is really an expression. It's like a linguistic expression of a deep social, political, economic motivation. And another element in the non-religious framework, or basically the general framework, is that individual values don't aggregate into collective behavior. So a good example of it is a university or any organization where when one observes the macro behavior of the individuals or the broad lines, it wouldn't be reflective of the very individual values of each one. It's an institution, so there are laws or policies guiding everyone, and you might have 100 people with 100 different sets of values, but they behave in a coherent way. Now that coherence or that doesn't reflect their values. So having pious Saudis does not mean that collectively they will behave piously. It's a different thing, and you have to separate them together. And then another important element, which in Saudi Arabia is, which might be specific to Saudi Arabia or countries similar to it, is that there isn't enough space for political competition. So people compete in the spaces available to them, and the easiest spaces available to them are religion and tradition. So in the end, you might find the king and the crown prince at one point competing, and when they compete, they don't compete through newspapers or through parties, or they compete through an issue as simple or insignificant as a woman working as a cashier in a supermarket. And so the issue becomes overblown. Once you see that the size of the issue is unproportional to the action, then you know that there's something behind it. It's not just that issue. It's not just religion or piety. There's a lot of politics, a lot of power struggles going on, and a lot of what is overblown in Saudi Arabia is really an expression of those underlying struggles between different powers in the country. Even things as serious as the judge, lashing a woman because she drove. I mean, that judgment or that court order wasn't made just out of legal considerations. It was an expression of some kind of resistance to King Abdullah's, let's say, direction, and it came out in that way. But in the end, there are more powers behind it. And then another thing is that religion and religiosity are too complicated to be agents. I mean, religion is as a word doesn't say much. I mean, religion could be the theology, it could be the identity, it could be the legislation, it could be the word religion itself is sort of an aggregate of so many things. So you can't put a word that includes many different types of things and say it causes that. It doesn't mean anything. If I say religion causes that, I would say, what do you mean by religion? Do you mean the theology? Do you mean the morality? Do you mean the sense of identity? Do you mean itself? The word includes many factors that are too complicated to be put together, and too different actually to be put together. So to say religion is an agent of change or an agent of anything, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then another and final extremely important consideration is that there is no vertical relationship between scripture and behavior. People don't just follow blindly. Even in Saudi Arabia, people in a way shop for the idea, shop for the fatwa or shop for the scripture which would accommodate their needs. In a way, people are negotiating with scripture to go back to that motivation, justification language trichotomy. So even a pious person is actually motivated or wants to do something. The drive to act comes usually first, and then then you start looking for something to justify it or to give it a name. So I'll just go through this one. So to go back to Yusuf al-Ahmad, again, the religious framework is, an impulse. Just to repeat the last statement. So Yusuf al-Ahmad, the traditional analysis would say that he's a pious person, and his piety pushed him towards fighting the deviances going on in Saudi Arabia, and to protect the country from corruption and Western values or whatever they say. But then you have the non-religious framework. Now, if one compares them, Yusuf al-Ahmad in the first framework would be a pious person, a quintessential pious person, and then he sees sins and he acts against them. A non-religious framework would see Yusuf al-Ahmad in a totally different way, and there's a social collective which he definitely represents. I mean, there are people who aren't happy about this, but that collective is living through rapid changes going on in the last 30, 40 years, This one of the biggest challenges people are facing is that the social structures are eroding. I mean, for example, a parent 40 years ago had a clear expectation of what he or she was, a clear expectation of what the son should behave or act. Relationships were very clear. Dependency relationships were very clear. Who depended on who was clear. And that created a sense of security. And in less than 30 years, the country shifted from that kind of situation to a situation where at the nucleus level, at the family level, suddenly expectations between parents and children changed. The expectations of roles changed. The expectations from women changed, from husbands, from fathers, So suddenly you have that kind of change in all structures of agency, at the family level, at the social level, even at the political level, and it creates anxiety, but out of 1 million people who live in that kind of anxiety, maybe 900,000 would be fine with it, but then you have 100,000 who might express it in a more, let's say, radical, and some would go to violence. But in the end, it's really an outcome of change, because people are losing a lot of ground because of that. Even the sense of meaning, the sense of our place in the world, the sense of centrality. So many values have changed and are still changing. It's a country in flux, and values are in flux, and that causes a lot of tension. And Yusuf Ahmed becomes not just a pious person, becomes more a representative or let's say a manifestation of those kinds of changes going on, him and those who follow his ideas. Now, just to quickly compare between both analysis, the alternatives, if we go back to the point we mentioned, that instead, in terms of what alternatives each framework would suggest, the first one would suggest that we propose other religious impulses, and all the language and all the discourse of moderation really stems from there, that religion causes radicalism in Saudi Arabia and in other countries, and so we have to promote moderation. My personal view is that even if we have moderates, we still have radicals. Moderation, even if we have moderates in religion, we still have radicals in social behavior. It's not a one-to-one relationship. Now, the other alternative, which the other framework proposes, is that people in Saudi Arabia, for example, specifically, need to be offered different ways of dealing with modernity. Modernism, one of the consequences of modernism is a risk society, for example. And if the educational curricula does not teach students to actually deal with risk, deal with ambiguities, deal with unpredictability in the future, that will cause anxiety, which will lead to radicalism. So even if they're moderate religiously, they'll still have the main underlying problem. Now, in terms of the approach, now the first alternative, which is other religious impulse, would basically create an approach to understanding scripture. And if one reads all the discourse of moderation, religious moderation, it's all about the Quran and all about the Hadith and how we should understand it differently. So we just really, it's a matter of hermeneutics in a sort of way. But then the approach for the other alternative would be to understand society, and that would definitely make the protagonist become different, because if my idea or if my main approach is to understand scripture, then the scholar would be the main protagonist in solving the problem of radicalism. But if my approach to solving radicalism is to understand the society, then my protagonist would be the politician, the social philosopher, and even the person on the street. I would have a different set of heroes or different set of people I need to talk with, and I need to convince to sort of create the change I want. And thank you.
So the way I thought we would do this is we'll talk a little bit about Abdullah's presentation, and then we'll open it up, the idea being that maybe we would simulate some more questions in your mind, and then open it up to you. We are basically here for you to answer any and all questions that you have. You're certainly not restricted to the things he presented about Saudi Arabia. Anything about Saudi Arabia and Islam, you're welcome to ask about. I found the presentation fascinating. I mean, that is a very sophisticated understanding of how behavior is shaped. I mean, one of the things that I always find when I talk about Islam and I teach about Islam is that people tend to think Islam is a monolithic thing, that it's one set of beliefs, and that all Muslims adhere to this one set of beliefs which are unchanging, that are a set of rules that everyone, a set of scriptures that everyone understands in one way and they behave in one way, and that Muslim societies are guided by these principles. So, for example, when you open a book up about, say, urban planning in Cairo, a lot of Western scholars will start with something, quotations from the Quran, and they'll try and derive the manifestation of urban planning in Egypt through something that is Islamic, through something that is urban planning. And I always ask people who do that kind of analysis, says, well, if that were the case, I mean, how would we look at New York City? Would we understand urban design in New York City through some quotations in the Bible? I mean, that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, wouldn't it? That's the same in Cairo. I mean, Cairo is driven by the same sorts of principles of urban planning and modernization that New York City is. The advent of the car and, industry and the problems that are inherent in industry and concentrations of people in a large area. These are not things that come from Islam. And so this kind of analysis where you are looking at other sources of people's motivations and why they behave, and seeing the religion as maybe secondary or interacting with those behaviors, I think is very useful.
Yeah, I mean, there's an example which might have, I forgot to mention. I was once working with a group of people on a project to promote volunteerism in Jeddah. And and then something funny happened. The whole discussion was based on what volunteerism is, how useful it is for society, and the kind of benefit it has on the individual and on his or her sense of giving. And when we came to the point where we wanted to write a document and share it with other people, at that point they started saying, why don't we put a verse from the Quran here? Why don't we put a hadith here? So in a way, the whole logic of promoting volunteerism was a general discussion about volunteerism in a very moral sense, in a very pre-scriptural moral sense. But then when you want to communicate it to others, or even to make it familiar to yourself, you had to put these kinds of verses so that it becomes, in a way, it's a way of incorporating whatever you're talking about into the culture. But when someone reads that afterwards, they would think that those scriptures were the guiding elements of that logic, when they weren't. Even someone reading the Quran when he commits suicide, some kind of I think it's post the motivation action. So he or she already wanted to commit suicide for whatever reason, and they go and read these scriptures to give that meaning, to give it value to themselves, but also to be able to communicate it to others in their culture. They can't communicate it without associating it with the symbols that people in their society or in their culture can relate to. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Same thing with extremism. I mean, there's a huge debate. I mean, what drives extremism? Is it religion? Obviously, there are other drivers to it: political drivers, social drivers, cultural drivers. But what's interesting is your framework. I mean, whether you approach it from a religiously driven framework, or maybe you should look for solutions and explanations outside that framework, and that's important. Another important element that you brought up is the reaction to modernity, and how that created dislocation in several societies. And we see that not just in Saudi Arabia, but throughout, obviously, the Middle East. There are huge differences. And to go back to your point, you can't view Islam as a monolith or Islamist movement as a monolith. Saudi society is different than Moroccan society, for example. And that's important to note when analyzing these societies. But it's interesting whether you have to reform through Scripture by going back to Scripture and reinterpreting it. Because what's Sharia, for example? I'm sure for you Americans, you hear this word, and I'm pretty confident each one of you obviously have some probably understanding of what it is. But the Sharia is not a code, for example. It's a set of rules and interpretations that was accumulated throughout the centuries, right? So there is no one Sharia. There is no one Islamic law. And that's important to understand. There are different Sharias, and that all goes to what interpretations you have. And he gave us one interpretation in that, whether it was a conservative interpretation, whether it was a radical interpretation. My interest, obviously, is more into politics, and that's what I'm looking at Saudi society, Saudi Arabia in the midst of the Arab Spring, for example, and how people are reacting to what's occurring in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere.
Yeah. I mean, again, maybe the main objective was to just take away religion as a center of analysis and then look at the country as everyone would look at any other country. So looking at it politically and socially. And it might be too extreme to say we have to decentralize religion, but I think it's a good it's a good starting point from the over-centralizing of religion. Although I do believe that religion doesn't play much. I mean, I see people behave religiously, and I've experienced it myself, and you know, and I can see the difference between their motivations and their justifications. But speaking of the Arab Spring, I mean, if you go back also to religion and the Arab Spring, in Saudi Arabia, part of the debate on the Arab Spring had a religious language, as people were talking about, should we support the Arab, uprisings because it causes, I mean, they were using some, let's say, religiously Islamic values about chaos and it being something not welcome, about disobedience to the ruler in some countries. In Saudi Arabia, some of the scholars were very keen to denounce some of the movements of the Arab Spring because the logic of some of the more conservative players in the country is that you have to obey your ruler regardless of how he behaves. So you had that kind of language, but then again, even if you take that language and analyze it, you would find that it's really driven by politics, is that the political establishment in Saudi Arabia, being worried about what's going on out there, needed people to denounce what's going on using religious terms. And in the end, youth in Saudi Arabia reacted to the Arab Spring the way everyone else did, except that they didn't take it a step further. And the reason is the dynamics between state and population. In other Arab countries, the state depends on the population for its livelihood in a way. I mean, states depend on either taxes or depend on foreign aid and maybe some local resources. But the state doesn't essentially own all the resources effectively. In Saudi Arabia, that's different. The state owns everything. So 90% of the economy is oil, and oil is controlled by the state. So that changes the whole dynamic between people and state, and in a way, it shapes the ceiling or constrains the ceiling of reaction. No matter how much people would react, they would be very careful not to damage the goose that lays the golden egg, because they want reform, but they wouldn't go as far as threatening the stability of disperse of resources. And this is the same thing. This applies equally to all the other Gulf countries, although they're smaller in population. But it's the same dynamic where you want the authority to reform, but not to be unstable, because then you lose the benefits that even those opposing it are living off it.
Well, one last comment that I have is that I know that in the feminist movement in the Arab world, actually throughout the Muslim world, there is this debate about whether to engage scripture or not. I mean, some feminists they adopt a Western model of feminism, which sort of sidelines scripture and say that feminism is based on human rights and that we should debate it this way. And others, like Asma Barlas, for example, she argues that feminism can't abandon scripture, that scripture is an important part of Muslim society, and that they should reclaim Scripture by debating, by going in and doing what you call the alternative scriptural debates. I don't think it necessarily means that they are staying within religion as the source of discourse, but they don't want to abandon it. They want to keep it as open as a front, as a number of different fronts in the battle for feminism. So I know that's a big debate within the feminists, whether to engage Scripture or not in the debate.
Yeah, I think in both cases, one would need to be engaged with Scripture. I mean, as long as Scripture is the only available language for people to express their motivations, you would have to engage in Scripture. You would have to sort of, from a practical perspective, there has to. But then, at least the analysis looks at Scripture as something that exists at the language level, not at the motivation level. Because then the intervention becomes different. Then I deal with Scripture as not a motivator. I deal with it as a language to express people's inner needs and aspirations. And when I approach Scripture in that regard, I would deal with it differently. I would consider the gravity of losing ground in this area differently than I would consider it in the other area. And but in the end, one has to engage in it. But also, and this is one of the outcomes, is we need to create a new language, a new non-scriptural language that people can appeal to and express their moral inclinations about their behavior. So we have motivation, justification, and then language. People need another kind of language, and it might take generations before people start accepting, well, actually not generations, maybe one or two, because for people to start accepting morality outside Scripture. Today I sit in Saudi Arabia, for example, there are some youth meetings which we do on a regular basis about religion and morality and all of that. And today I see more and more young people saying that something is good because it's good. I don't need a verse to actually justify the goodness of anything. 20 years ago, it was very difficult to find someone to say that being honest is good because it's good. Being honest is good because the Scripture dictated that it's good. Now today you find people saying no, that innate morality is becoming more and more available to many people. So once that develops, soon you will have at least two alternative ways of moralizing. A scriptural morality or moralizing language, and then you also have a non-scriptural morality, which depends on the common innate morality every human has. And this is also significant for relationships with the others, because if I'm going to relate to somebody, to a non-Muslim, if my morality is based on Islam, then and his or her morality is based on whatever, then there will always be a gap. So we respect honesty, but for two different reasons. So there's always like a one-step relationship between us. But if we start respecting honesty for the same reason, because honesty is good, or because goodness is good, or because charity is good, then in a way I would relate to the other in a more maybe intimate way. I would see that we're really close, and we relate to the same set of values for the same set of reasons, not for different set of reasons. So yes, we have to play with Scripture, but we also need to develop a new language, which is happening organically, actually, without even one working for it.
Does that indicate a trend of the separation of state and religion?
Yeah, in Saudi Arabia, state and religion are separated. I mean, by de facto. The Saudi state is a very clever state. What it does, it's things that are strategically imperative happen regardless of religion. For example, banks. The greatest sin in Islam, according to the, let's say, conservative elements, is usury, riba. And there are so many metaphors about how bad riba is. It's basically second to polytheism or to non-belief in God. Worse than fornication, than adultery, than maybe killing comes worse than it. But it's really bad. But despite that, since the establishment of the state, and they've had interest-based banks, and the religious, conservative elements have been fighting the idea of banks ever since, and the state never really cared about that. So what the state does, it divides the domains of intervention into two: strategic and then social. it doesn't intervene in the social things. So let's say women. Women's rights are part of a social fabric. It's not strategically important for the country now for women to work. I mean, with all the language and discourse about being half the population and all of that, in the end, the country's productivity is based on oil, not on people. So it doesn't really need women to do, it doesn't need people for the development of the country. And I'm talking from a very, so in a way, they would say, well, okay, we don't need this strategically, so we're not going to challenge the authority of the patriarch in the house, because then it makes us go against the society. I don't want to challenge the father's authority. I don't want to challenge the community's sense of solidarity. All of these things are too sensitive. So let them live as they want, and if they change, they change. And then it in a way it gives that domain to those conservative elements to play with, but it doesn't really. So in a way, but the elements such as banking, relationships with the West, relationships with Aramco when it came in, all of these issues are strategically important. So regardless of what the religious conservative elements say, it doesn't care. And you see it all the time, and you can see a clear divide between the kind of issues the state allows religion to play a role in, and the issues that the state doesn't allow religion to play a role in. And so there is effectively a division. But the trend that's really happening, which is more, is quite significant, is that you have a development, a very micro development, but all the reasons for it growing exist, of a de-institutionalized religiosity, where people still preserve a sense of religiosity, but without adhering to the institution, breaking away from it, and more individualized even religions. And it's still among a very small sector of the youth, but it's there, and I expect in 20, 30 years to become something like in other countries, in Egypt or in Iran, or where in the West, in Europe and America, it's been there for a while. People who are outside the institution yet religious. They have a spirituality, they have faith in God and the Prophet, but they don't adhere to the institutional interpretation of the Quran or of the Hadith, so that's happening, and I think that will increase in the next few years.
Given the fact that the society is in flux, given the fact that the resources are controlled by the state, what's the size of the middle class? And is the middle class in Saudi Arabia more or less, or does it have more or less monolithic vision, which I think I can safely argue it does have in other developing societies, the dynamic society, it's a change-oriented, class. It's a visionary class. Is there such a class in Saudi Arabia?
Did you hear his question back there? Yeah, no. He was talking about the development of a middle class, and how often in society a middle class is the class that instigates change. It's the one that has visions for change in the future, for a better future. And he's asking whether such a class exists in Saudi Arabia.
There aren't enough statistics, but if one takes anecdotal or analysis that you read on the newspapers, the general impression is that the middle class is eroding, it's shrinking. More people are going either to the upper middle class or to the poverty level. Poverty is a problem in Saudi Arabia. It's growing. When you mention 11% unemployment, it's an indicator of a certain financial situation. And as I said, that number is a very conservative official number. The real numbers are always higher, up to even double in terms of. So there is an eroding middle class. But the more important, or maybe the more significant part is what you were saying, is their role. I mean, regardless of the numbers, what role can they play in a country where the state does not depend on the middle class? I mean, the middle class was important because it was the source of funding or taxation, or it was where the country depended on in terms of its resources. In Saudi Arabia, even if you had a big middle class, they don't represent a major source that the state will depend on. So their relationship to the state will always be limited by that. What will happen is you'll have different sets of aspirations, needs and requirements, but they will always go to the state and ask it. So it's a small middle class, but regardless of its size, whether it exists, whether the statistics or the analysis are accurate or not, in the end, all the classes depend on the state for their well-being. I think almost 90% of the economy depends on, maybe 85% now, depends on oil. So you don't have another source of income for the overall country, and this is a major problem which the country will face in a few years, because the demographics are changing. The population is increasing at a rapid pace, and there will be a point where the government cannot depend on oil to sustain the population. There's a point I have to mention. In Saudi Arabia, people don't pay taxes. I had to mention that before. Yeah. So that's what I meant. The country does not depend on people. Some corporations, especially foreign corporations, pay taxes, but that's really minimal. But you can live your whole life without paying, a dime in terms of taxation, and that definitely creates a certain kind. If you take no taxation without representation, then the other way around also works. If you don't have taxation, then you don't need to have representation.
Yeah.
I think what your presentation shows is sort of the purpose of theoretical analysis is that, my observations, if you just took out the references to Islam, I felt like you were talking about the country I live in.
Yeah.
The United States, and the role of, religious perspectives in politics, people who use a religious framework versus a non-religious framework, in your discussion about language and alternative languages. And in the United States, we do have an alternative moral language that's sort of embedded, in our civic religion. But what I find interesting at this moment in time, where Americans think we own modernity, right? So we were the agents of it, but now we're sort of realizing we're also the victims of it. So it'll be interesting to see, if in 50 years, that there's sort of a not radical, but more like reactionary element that the only moral language they have is scripture.
Yeah.
And that's what they're going to resort to. And what I think is interesting is that the secular left in our country started to take us away from Saudi Arabia. But I think that's the beauty of talking about other countries, is it makes you think about your own. But is that the left in this country has been afraid of using, at least in the last maybe 20 years, is afraid of using moral language because they feel like moral language has to be religious, even though we have this rich tradition. And so I think, what we have is one side in society using moral language. And in the cases we have it, it's atrophy, whereas in Saudi Arabia or other parts of the Muslim world, it hasn't been developed yet. But it's odd that I wouldn't say I feel like I'm living in Saudi Arabia, but because I do pay taxes. But anyway, I just think it's an interesting. I think again that's the beauty of theory. When it's presented as well as you did it, that you could say, okay, this is actually very applicable to most societies that have religious impulses and moral questions and are afraid of change, or have to deal with change.
Yeah. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because it is something which I lean towards, is that once you go at that level, soon identities in a way, become invisible. It can apply in almost any situation, and it can easily apply. Once I was talking to a friend about, he was telling me about some religious communities in Israel, Jewish communities, and I felt, if the whole language, the whole 10 minutes he was talking, if I just took away Israel and took away Rabbi and took away Jewish, he would have been talking exactly about a community I know in Riyadh or in Qasim. The same way of behavior, the same way of reacting, the same way of. It's amazing, once you once you see these elements, religion as just religion, not just as religions, then things become in a way similar. And yes, in the Arab world and even in the Arab Spring now, people are resorting to some of the more religious elements, the Muslim Brotherhood. Some would say that because they haven't been, given a chance before. But I think there's also another element, which is modernity creates anxiety. Scriptures are safe. They've been written 1400 years ago or 2000 years ago, and it's very easy to get an answer. Once you want civic morality, then it's all about it has to be developed ongoingly. It's not stable. It creates a lot of tension for many people who just want an answer. They don't want something which they have to actually engage in debate and discuss. So we'll have to see if that kind of insecurity will give more prominence to more reactionary elements or not. I see it in Saudi Arabia to a degree. I see it in some other Arab countries, though I'm not, just through the news. I'm not living there. We'll see.
Please, yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to follow up on a couple of things. One is, to what extent is there a feminist movement within Saudi Arabia? And I know that for many feminists who are Muslims, going back not necessarily just to scripture, but to Muhammad's life and his first wife, and that there's a good bit within the origins of Islam for women, for feminists to point to. So that's so I'd like to hear a little bit about what is happening.
Yeah, feminism can mean many things, but the feminism or the trend which focuses on change on legislation is quite prominent. You don't have a lot of feminists focusing on gender or as an issue. Very, very few actually, and the reason is that the feminist discourse is very much influenced by the rights movement within feminism. So other forms of feminism haven't gained enough, let's say, primacy. Another challenge is that to develop the other forms of feminism, you need to have a lot of theoretical discussions and more deep discussion. It's more complicated, and people are too active or too busy just on the streets. But in terms of the other, feminists or women demanding their rights, there's quite a strong movement. It's becoming more and more organized, and they're polarized around 3-4 issues which they see as important. Driving, for example, the right of a woman to act without her guardian. In Saudi Arabia, there are still some things which need a guardian, a male guardian actually. A woman cannot travel if she's under 45. She can't travel without a male guardian giving her approval, for example. It could be her son even. That's really a bit odd, but that's how it is. And then you also have some of their judicial issues, in court laws that, especially in terms of guardianship for children and all of that. So there is a movement. It's active especially in the central cities, Riyadh, Jeddah, and Dhahran. And they do resort back to Islam a lot, especially to the Prophet's life. Although you have now a sort of counter-feminist movement, it's not really yet a movement, but it's all, let's say, voices that are trying to be critical of religion as the reason for the oppression of women in Saudi Arabia. So while, let's say, for example, somebody would mention the Prophet and his first wife, others would mention the Prophet and his 9 wives, for example. They would, and that's why the problem of history becomes, like everyone picks whatever fits in a way. They would pick, let's say, the Prophet's marriage to Aisha, or when she was 9 years old, I think the marriage was, and then consummated at 11 or 12. So you have that kind of rising movement, but they're very limited in their numbers because you can't actively mobilize people using that kind of language. But you find it on some writings on Facebook, on Twitter, on even in closed meetings. But most of the public feminist movements focus on on the issue of let's say driving, labor, guardianship, and such things. Yeah.
Well, I have another question, it's somewhat related, but to what extent within Islam and Saudi Arabia is there an acceptance of different interpretations of the Quran?
Yeah, not much. I mean, I mean, that's a quick answer. But it really depends. I mean, to make it more complicated, it really depends on the source of the different interpretations. So if the different interpretations are classical different interpretations, then it's accepted. It's not really different interpretation that matters. What matters to them, to people in Saudi Arabia, and I think in other Muslim countries as well, is the methodology of interpretation. So you have the literal interpretation, or you have, let's say, the historical interpretation. The historical interpretation would situate scripture in a historical context and make it more relative to the times of the Prophet, so to say, versus the interpretation which would say that the scripture is comprehensive, it says everything that we ever need, and it's everlasting. So if you come from that perspective where the Quran said everything that we need and for all times, you would be given an opportunity to have it to be different, because that's what happened in the Islamic history. I mean, you never had two people having the same interpretation. But you have to belong to that kind of school, and you have to depend on some kind of, let's say, the more precedence you have, the better you are. The challenge is in people who are offering new methods of interpretation, hermeneutical, modern hermeneutics, which sort of situates the Quran in a certain historical, socio-political era and tries to interpret it in that regard. Now that's absolutely rejected, not even given space to talk. Now rejected by rejected I mean by the more, by the mainstream. You can even be considered a heretic if you actually state it in any kind of way or form. But and when I said not much, that's what I mean, because in the end, that kind of diversity at the level of method is what really expresses diversity. But it's like, the statement which says the house always wins. So if I'm always restricted to that method, no matter how different I am from them, I'm still within their own field. So if I always depend on a fatwa to do something which I want, then I'm still sustaining the institution of the fatwa. So in a way, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're always stuck in it, no matter how much you think you actually left, but you're actually still tied to the institution. And the challenge is to break away from it.
That reminded me of your talk on riba, is that what it is?
Yeah.
Banking? Yeah. Just took me to the pre-Reformation Europe. So, I mean, to follow on that, is there any chance in Islam for the rise of a Martin Luther so that Reformation takes Islam to be compatible with modernity?
I mean, this is a big question. Maybe, I think today you need Martin Luther, not just one. I mean, and there are a few. I mean, the situation is so complicated, and the countries are so different that you would have to have so many people that would. I don't think today it will be one person, the way it was, like one mega person that would, be bigger than life, and you had some attempts. You had like Muhammad Arkoon. He had his attempts, but he was considered an absolute heretic, even an infidel by some Muslims. You had Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid from Egypt. He was trying something like that, but he was also not accepted. Muhammad Abd al-Jabari, he's from Morocco. Before he passed away, he wrote a book on the interpretation of the Quran, and he tried to apply certain kinds of a new method to reading the Quran. So you have these small attempts. The problem is their ability to diffuse. And if one considers the Islamic world, I mean the average literacy, I think, is about illiteracy reaches about 80%, 75 to 80%. So that creates a big challenge for any kind of change at that level, because you need people who can read, who can talk with you. The issue has to develop through discussions. Maybe in the pre-Reformation society, an elite debate was enough to generate a macro or a mass change. Today, elite debates are irrelevant. Today, Twitter debates might even, be more effective. So, with that, so I don't know. I mean, we hope. Yeah.
One thing I might add to this is, we need to maybe think a little bit about what we mean by modernity, because if for example the riba in the banking, I mean the way that most Islamic countries, if you're going to interpret in terms of scripture, you just say that interest is not a usury. That interest is a normal rate of return that's expected. A high rate of interest would be considered usury. But they say, they use a context. This is a historical contextual analysis to do this. And this passes in Saudi Arabia. This goes. But when we talk about modernity, I mean some of the modernity simply means kind of a worship of the new. The idea that science and reason can advance our human goods, and that the purpose of life is for individual achievement and individual good, and that innovation is good. That the idea that change is good. This is kind of modernity. But if we think about this, I mean, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they're a modern expression of Islam, and they came not from the traditional ulama, but they came from school teachers. They came from the street as a civic reform movement. And so this is a very modern expression of Islam. So we need to think a little bit about what we're talking about when we say modernity, because it's not the case that modernity causes anxiety. It's something else that's causing anxiety. It's some part of modernity, because much of the reaction actually is modern itself. The fact that somebody draws on scripture doesn't mean that they're going to the past. No, they're actually interpreting something new in the present, right?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
I feel like this theoretical approach to morality and analysis is highly unlikely in any religious population, because religion tends to be something that guides you not just as an aspect of your life, but as everything in your life. So when you remove religion, especially from something like political analysis, it's giving it the backseat. It's making it less important. And there's people who are attached to religion find it more important than something like politics. Usually what guides you through everything you do. So I feel like generally not only Muslims, but other religious populations won't take this approach, because it's actually generally an approach that's seen with people who don't follow religion. And I feel like this type of approach isn't something that's going to be achieved on a large scale, broadly speaking.
Yeah, that's a very valid point or argument, which one would say is that, as you said, the personal experience seems to give religion a primary role in motivating behavior. But I would say two things to it. One, it could be very well accurate, so one would have to modify the whole argument based on that. But then one can also say that even if individuals, and I mentioned this, even if individuals behave as individuals religiously, it doesn't mean that when they interact socially, the social interaction would be also religious. I mean, it's very much the example I mentioned in corporations, where you might have pious people in a corporation, but the corporation doesn't act piously, or it acts based on the imperatives, on its mandate, or on its mission, or whatever. But more importantly, I think that one has to go beyond the self-proclamations. I mean, if I claim religion motivates me, it doesn't mean that religion actually motivates me, because people, this is one of the basic premises of psychology, is that sometimes we don't really know what motivates us until we actually do a very deep introspective process, maybe guided by someone else, so that we can enter some kind of discourse together. But sometimes we find that what we say motivates us doesn't really motivate us. And I think one of the challenges in such an approach or in both approaches, the one that gives religion a fundamental and a central role, or the one that takes that away from it, is we have to ask ourselves to what degree are self-proclamations enough in defining what motivates us. So if we think that they don't, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, I say religion motivates me, but is that the real situation? And I have to really be not only honest. It's not about being honest with myself, it's about being accurate. And sometimes it takes a while before one realizes that what I think motivated me was something else. And but the question remains, and your point is, I mean, you know, it's one of the main points against this whole thing, is that people claim religion is the most important thing, not politics, not economy. And I hear that all the time, and I think anyone would be intimidated if I tell him, no, you're actually motivated by socio-economic reasons. But what I think needs to be added is that we are motivated by morality many times, but I think morality and religion sometimes are conflated, because if the only moral language I have is religious, I will sometimes think that I am being religious, when in essence I am actually being moral, but using religion as a language for that morality.
You're suggesting that you go through the self-discovery and determine the actual realization. You have to take a step back and test religion in a sense from your thoughts and analysis of everything you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, let's say, for example, scripture. If we talk about religion, I think the best example is scripture. If I take some of the Quranic verses and ask myself, am I following them or am I using them? And some of the cases of fatwa are quite interesting. When you find people looking for somebody to give them a fatwa, a religious decree, and they're actually looking for the mufti or the scholar that will give them the decree that meets their needs. So in a way, you already sense that there is already a decision. So morally, I feel this is wrong and this is right, and I'm looking for that mufti which will tell me the same thing, but put it in a more maybe religiously structured language. And this is quite prevalent, this behavior. So it's a good indicator of the role between scripture and person. Is my morality or is my aspiration, does it precede scripture, or does scripture actually dictate it? Now you'll find, on the other hand, some behaviors, especially let's say some commands which one acts, which one follows absolutely. But what I mean, it's more complicated, and you have to take the whole picture. But I think, in essence, yes, one has to go back to him or herself and see where does scripture play a role, and versus morality, versus selfishness, versus interest, and then it becomes more complicated.
Sorry, can you speak up?
That behavior is common in politics, because then politicians, say, if Islamophobes even will find scripture as tools to manipulate and express their ideas. So it's kind of difficult to tell when someone is being genuine or when they're trying to do a valid point and manipulating scripture.
Yeah.
So it's to figure out in general how people are thinking. So it's interesting that you apply this theory of thinking to the general spectrum of society.
Yeah, because also not in politics. I mean, I've seen it with people who want to work in a bank in Saudi Arabia, where they find, and they go and look for scholars which will say working in a bank is not a sin. And I've seen it in people who want to go to Mecca and dress in a certain way. I've seen it with women who want to take off the cover of their face. I mean, you see it not only with politicians. It's there and it's very obscene, but you also see it in the day-to-day lives of people, where they are looking for a religious way to justify their existing behavior.